Welcome to Rise and Thrive Stories. Stories that inspire us all, and this is today's story.
A Gentleman's Retaliation is an elegant story about Daniel Hale, a man whose life is built on integrity, composure, and devotion to family. When he discovers subtle signs that his wife, Lara, is having an affair with an ambitious young manager, his world doesn't collapse, it becomes sharper. Rather than explode or retaliate violently, Daniel embarks on a silent but deadly journey, combining grace, intelligence, and legal precision. Through meticulous investigation, he uncovers not just an affair, but a family conspiracy that uses his wealth for its own downfall. The story explores the line between dignity and revenge, drawing viewers into the portrait of a man who chooses graceful destruction over brutal rage. Before we get into the story, please subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories, and leave a comment below to let us know from which city or country you are watching. Dusk had just fallen when Daniel Hale entered his home, a home he built not for showy luxury, but as a sanctuary for himself and his wife, Lara. Golden light crept in through the large windows, casting long shadows on the gleaming marble floor. "Lara," he called softly, his voice filled with the calm of a man who always gave his wife space. There was no answer. The house was too quiet, not a calm that was soothing, but a quiet that sent a subtle hint that something was no longer as it had been. Daniel sighed, took off his watch, and stood for a moment in the middle of the room, feeling the atmosphere shift without understanding the cause. Footsteps sounded from the stairs. Lara appeared beautiful, well-groomed, but hurried, as if Daniel's presence were an obstacle, not a welcome home. "Oh, you're home," she said, her voice a mix of surprise and indifference. Daniel smiled faintly, keeping his tone gentle. "Shall we have dinner together? It's been a long time since we sat together." Lara hung up the phone too quickly. "I have a community meeting." "Urgent," she said, her eyes avoiding his. "Evening meeting?" she asked quietly, not accusing, just making sure. Lara replied with a thin, forced smile. "Yeah. Don't wait for me." After Lara hurried out, Daniel stood there for a few seconds, listening to the door close, which felt colder than usual. The lingering scent of perfume in the air wasn't Lara's usual scent, stronger, more expensive, and definitely not one he'd ever bought for her. Daniel walked into the living room and sat down, letting his mind work quietly. He wasn't panicked, wasn't angry. Just observing. "We used to tell each other everything," he murmured, touching their framed wedding photo. "When did it start to change, Lar?" A bitter irony crossed his lips, but he held it back with characteristic elegance. 11 p.m. passed without any news. Daniel finally opened his laptop, trying to distract himself by checking some client reports. But his eyes landed on a folder of newly received transactions. There was a strange pattern, small but frequent transfers, all to the same name, Evan Mercer, a young manager who had recently been featured frequently in business articles as a star of the future. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the trackpad. "Interesting," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just the silence of a man who had just learned that his patience was about to be tested in the most unexpected way. Just as the clock struck 12, the front door opened slowly. Lara entered, her face holding a smile she shouldn't have brought home. Daniel stood, unhurried, unconfrontational. "You're home later than usual," he said softly. Lara froze, then tried to hide her nervousness. "Sorry, the meeting was long." Daniel nodded slowly, then looked at her with a look that was no longer naive, but not angry either. "Just aware." "I understand," he said simply. And behind that simple sentence, something inside him changed. Where before he had been a man of trust, he was now a man who had begun to silently observe. With a calmness sharper than anger, Daniel Hale began to piece together the first pieces of a dark truth. The next morning, Daniel woke early. Not because he was restless, he rarely was, but because his mind was starting to work like a precision machine. From the bathroom, he heard Lara's voice chuckling as she spoke into the phone. "Yeah. I miss you too," she said softly, but clearly enough for anyone paying attention. When she realized Daniel was approaching, she quickly ended the call. "Who?" Daniel asked calmly, drying his hands without looking at her. Lara shook her head quickly. It doesn't matter. Daniel nodded, as if accepting the answer. But beneath his composure, he hid a simple sentence that defied logic: a happy wife doesn't hide her laughter like a thief in the night. At breakfast, Lara sat opposite him, but her eyes kept glancing at her upside-down phone screen. "Do you have a lot of work today?" Daniel asked, sipping his coffee with a calmness suspicious to anyone but himself. "It's okay," Lara replied, smiling faintly but nervously. "Then, come home early," Daniel said, not an order, just a gentle invitation. Lara stiffened immediately. "I might have another community activity." Daniel nodded. "Sure." There was no coldness in his tone, no anger, just the calm of a man who has begun to read patterns. And there is no pattern more honest than the nervousness of someone who feels threatened by the attention he supposedly longs for. After work, Daniel visited the office of Adrian Voss, his friend and lawyer. "I need something," Daniel said matter-of-factly, sitting with the grace of a man ready to weather a storm. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Detective?" Daniel stared at him. "No. At least not yet." Adrian closed the file in his hand. "What happened?" Daniel pointed to his phone screen, an image of a strange transaction he'd discovered last night. "I wonder if this is all a coincidence, or part of something more sinister." Adrian sighed. "And you want all this done, quietly?" Daniel smiled slightly. "Like a shadow." Adrian handed over a card. "Jordan Price. Independent investigator. Doesn't talk much, doesn't ask many questions." Daniel accepted the card expressionlessly. "Good." Adrian stared at it a moment longer. "And what about Lara?" Daniel held his breath for a moment, something he rarely did. "I will always treat her with respect," he said quietly, "even when she doesn't treat me the same." Adrian nodded slowly. "You're too kind, Dan." Daniel smiled blankly. "Or too patient." As night falls, Daniel comes home to find Lara dressed much more beautifully than usual. "Community?" he asks softly. Lara is surprised, nervous, then nods quickly. "Yes." Daniel examines her from head to toe, elegant dress, different perfume, makeup she never wears to community meetings. "Be careful on the road," he says with a gentle smile. Lara pauses at the door, staring at him as if trying to read what she knows. But Daniel is too calm to be guessed. When the door closes, Daniel sits down, turns on the reading lamp, and mutters softly, "We'll see where you go tonight." The next morning, Daniel decided to leave work early without telling Lara. His steps were calm as he opened the door, but his heart was racing. Whispers could be heard from the living room, then they stopped abruptly when the door opened. Lara stood with her phone in her hand, her face pale for a split second before she forced a smile. "Why, you're home early?" she asked. Daniel placed his keys and jacket gently on the table, his gaze warm but scrutinizing. "Coming back early isn't a problem, is it?" he said quietly, almost jokingly. But the gentle tone was enough to make Lara pull her phone behind her, and Daniel saw it. He didn't react. He simply stored everything, every small movement, every breath, every instability in Lara's expression, like pieces of a puzzle he would complete in time. Daniel walked into the kitchen, pretending to prepare a drink of water while watching Lara through the reflection in the glass cabinet. "Who are you calling?" he asked lightly, without pressure. Lara flinched slightly, then answered too quickly, "A friend from the community." Daniel closed the refrigerator and looked at her gently. "A community that meets until midnight 2 days in a row?" Lara paused for a split second, then forced a laugh. "They're certainly inefficient," she said. Daniel smiled slowly, a smile that didn't corner, didn't interrogate, but instead made Lara appear more anxious. I see." He went back to drinking his water without saying anything else, but his eyes continued to read his wife's body language like a business report, calm, objective, yet sharp to the point. That afternoon, Daniel met Adrian Vossen, a sharp-faced man with a calm demeanor, Jordan Pierce, a private detective renowned for his silent, traceless investigations. They sat in Adrian's private office meeting room. "I'm not after drama," Daniel said. "I just want the truth." Jordan nodded once, professionally. Who's the subject? Daniel swiped 2 photos, Lara and Evan Mercer at a business gala. Follow them. Don't be seen. I want clean, irrefutable evidence. Adrian stared at Daniel for a long moment. You're handling this too calmly for someone who might be betrayed. Daniel stared back, his gaze as calm as the surface of the water before a storm. Emotions make people careless. I can't be careless. Jordan regarded Daniel with newfound respect. They knew, this wasn't a man about to explode. This was a man who would retaliate with precision. As evening approached, Lara dressed and prepared to go out again. Daniel sat on the sofa reading, but his attention was completely drawn to the sound of footsteps and the way he checked his phone. I have another meeting, Lara said, her voice less assertive than usual. Daniel slowly lowered his book. Third evening meeting in 3 days? His tone wasn't challenging, it was too flat, and that's what made Lara swallow hard. Yes, there's an evaluation, she said nervously. Daniel smiled softly. Hope it goes well. Lara paused, not understanding why she felt so much more afraid of her husband's kindness than of his anger. She left hurriedly, leaving a lingering scent of anxiety in the air. As soon as the door closed, Daniel put down his book. Outside the large window, the city lights began to light up like artificial stars witnessing the silence of human pain. His phone vibrated. A message from Jordan, target moving. Headed to the same hotel as yesterday. Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment, his face expressionless. Okay, he replied. There was no emotional outburst, just a heavy silence. He went to his office, opened his safe, and began compiling documents, a change of financial course, securing personal assets, and a plan if this game had to go to court. That night, Daniel Hale wasn't a man who had been hurt, he was a man laying the foundation for the most elegant revenge anyone who underestimated him would ever witness. That morning, Daniel woke earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen, but his mind was already working with a measured calm. Lara was still asleep with her back to him, her phone lying on the edge of the bed, screen down, a new habit that hadn't occurred in years past. Daniel stared at her for a few seconds, not as a suspicious husband, but as a man slowly accepting that love was no longer a reason to close his eyes. He got up slowly, picked up his own phone, and opened the latest message from Jordan. We got something. Visual evidence. We should meet. Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, then exhaled long, calm, and determined. That day, the pieces of truth would begin to come together. When Lara woke, Daniel was already in the kitchen preparing coffee, a habit he always followed with great care. Morning, Daniel greeted softly. Lara smiled faintly, looking a little awkward since Daniel was usually still sleeping at this hour. You're up early, she said, sitting at the dining table. Lot of work, Daniel replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee. He noticed Lara's body language, restless, checking her phone too often, overly cautious. Any plans today? Daniel asked as if it were just small talk. Community practice. Maybe until tonight. Daniel smiled kindly, a smile that made Lara lower her head. Be careful, okay? Lara swallowed. When someone you're lying to remains too gentle, that's exactly what scares you. The meeting with Jordan took place in a quiet hotel lounge, away from the crowds. Daniel sat unhurriedly, displaying a composure that even Jordan admired. I have these, Jordan said, opening a black folder and revealing several photos, Lara checking into the same hotel 2 nights in a row, Evan Mercer following 5 minutes later, their travel schedules overlapping, the room payment being made to a third party. Daniel watched it all with a broken expression. Jordan hesitated before asking, Are you okay? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Fine, he replied quietly. Facts never hurt. Lies, that's what's dangerous. He closed the folder slowly, neatly, elegantly. Continue surveillance. We're not done yet. That evening, Daniel returned home a little early. Lara almost jumped in surprise when she saw him open the door. You back early, she asked, her voice too high to sound natural. Daniel smiled softly. Well, I missed dinner at home. Lara swallowed hard, then quickly closed the laptop she had opened. I have to go later. I have an extra meeting. Daniel pretended to be shocked. Again? I just finished yesterday. Lara immediately offered a long excuse she didn't even believe herself, and Daniel listened intently. Then, Daniel finally said, "Don't come home too late. You look tired." It was a simple sentence. But to Lara, it sounded like an accusation wrapped in satin. When Lara finally left, Daniel closed the door gently, then stood staring at the doorknob, still vibrating gently from his wife's hurried footsteps. He exhaled softly, then walked to his study. There, he reopened the folder containing the evidence Jordan had given him. For the first time since all this began, Daniel covered his face with his hands. Not because of heartbreak, that feeling had long since expired, but because he had finally accepted that someone he had placed all his trust in had so easily lost it. After a few seconds, he straightened up again, staring ahead with eyes that were now much sharper. "Okay, Lar," he whispered. "If this is a game, I'll play it. But my way." That night, a light rain fell, creating a gentle tapping on Daniel's study window. He sat staring at the transaction report he had printed earlier. The numbers were no longer just data, they were patterns, traces, and stories of a betrayal he had always refused to believe. His phone vibrated, a text from Jordan Pierce. "I have something. Need to meet tonight." Daniel closed his file slowly, like a man preparing for a new chapter. He stood, grabbed his long coat, and stared at his reflection in the mirror, an elegant face that remained calm, but his eyes now radiated the light of a man prepared to face the truth without fear. Daniel arrived at a small, nearly closed cafe, a place Jordan liked to meet clients because it had a corner of the room out of reach of CCTV cameras. Jordan was already sitting in his black leather jacket, an untouched cup of coffee in front of him. "I found something," Jordan said matter-of-factly. He placed a thick envelope containing photos in front of him. Daniel opened it slowly, and the first photo immediately made the air in the room seem to freeze. Lara, his wife of many years, walked into a hotel with Evan Mercer. They laughed. Too close. Too comfortable. Jordan watched Daniel's reaction. There was no outburst of anger. No wild emotion. Just a far more dangerous silence. "Continue," Daniel said quietly. Jordan handed him the next photo, a photo taken from a very safe distance, showing Evan touching Lara's back as they entered a hotel elevator. "They've met 5 times in the last 3 weeks," Jordan said. "And all in different locations, but with the same pattern." Daniel examined the photos one by one. His hands remained steady, his gaze focused. "Financial evidence, communication, movement," he murmured, like an executive analyzing investment risk, not a man whose heart had been ripped out. Jordan regarded Daniel with respect. "You're really different, Daniel. Most people would be angry." Daniel smiled faintly. "Anger makes fools. I have no room for stupidity." After the cafe closed, Daniel and Jordan talked outside, under the dim light of a street lamp. The rain had stopped, leaving behind the scent of wet earth. "What's the next step?" Jordan asked. Daniel tucked the photos back into the envelope. "Continue surveillance. I want a complete pattern, time, location, who initiated contact, who paid for the room, who booked the transportation." Jordan nodded. "And, about her family?" Daniel stared at her for a moment. "Keep an eye on them too. If they're part of this, I want to know before they can act." There was a firmness in his voice, not a threat, but the resolve of a man whose patience has reached its limit. On the drive home, Daniel leaned his head against the car seat, letting his thoughts run with razor-sharp precision. All the pieces began to connect: the transaction, Lara's lies, Evan's unusual closeness, and Lara's family's suspicious behavior, which in recent months had been making unreasonable requests for small financial assistance. That night, for the first time, Daniel didn't feel lost. Instead, he felt clarity. If before he had been a man with suspicion, now he was a man with proof. And a man with proof was a very difficult man to bring down. When he got home, he stared out the large window at the night sky. "Lar," he whispered, not sadly, but with a cool calm, "you have no idea what you're waking up to." That morning, Daniel Hale stood in front of his office's large window, watching the city still shrouded in a thin fog. His mind was no longer clouded with doubt, he now moved like a hunter who knew his prey was moving, unaware of the large shadow behind it. Jordan Price arrived just in time, opening a black folder containing the night's observations. "They met again," Jordan said quietly. Daniel didn't overreact, he simply nodded, as if the report were merely a continuation of a predictable pattern. "Keep going. We need to know how far they've gone," he said calmly. The words, spoken without anger, were more deadly than any shout. Jordan opened several photos zoomed in from the remote camera. In them, Lara was wearing a dress she had never worn in front of Daniel Boulder, more striking, and Evan Mercer was wearing the arrogant smile that only a man who felt untouchable could possess. Daniel looked at each one. Even when he saw Evan touch Lara's back, his fingers didn't tremble. "They don't realize their world is just one step away from collapsing," Daniel said quietly. Jordan observed his composure, then said, "You really don't want to attack them now?" Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. A hasty fall doesn't have lasting effects." That afternoon, Daniel attended a meeting with major clients. His appearance remained impeccable, a dark suit, neat hair, and body language that conveyed complete control. No one could have guessed that this man was unraveling his wife's betrayal. But beneath his focused gaze, he noticed one important thing: Marcus Vellman, his old boss and mentor, was staring at him more often today. "You seem different, Dan," Marcus said when the meeting was over. "More intense." Daniel smiled faintly. "I'm just learning to pay attention to the little things." Marcus patted him on the shoulder with a hint of concern. "Don't let the little things eat away at you." Daniel replied calmly, "Sometimes the little things reveal the big things." Late in the afternoon, Daniel received a text from Jordan. They met again in a different place. "The pattern is becoming clearer." Daniel read the message as he sipped his black coffee. He sat alone on his apartment balcony, letting the afternoon breeze touch his face. In the distance, the city lights began to come on, like stars descending to earth to witness the dark drama unfolding. "Keep going," Daniel replied. No part of him wanted to stop. Every piece of evidence that came in was just fuel for the grand plan he was building. A plan that had to be perfect, without flaws, without emotions interfering with the precision. That night, Daniel opened Lara's personal financial files and discovered a new pattern: luxury trips, watch purchases, and high-end restaurant reservations, all paid for with the supplemental card he had been allowing Lara to use without due process. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not out of hurt, but to perfectly plot his next move. "Time to cut off the supply," he whispered. He called his lawyer and gave him firm but elegant instructions: restrict access, freeze the supplemental card, and prepare for legal action if necessary. When he hung up, Daniel stood facing the large window. His reflection was calm, but beneath the calm, a storm was brewing, a storm that would strike with neat beauty and ruthless precision. The night air was gentle as Daniel opened the door to his home office. City lights glinted from the large windows, casting a faint glow that made the room feel like a secret observation platform. On his desk, Jordan had left a brown envelope, the results of the previous 48 hours of investigation. Daniel stared at it for a long moment before opening it. He didn't rush, didn't tremble. His hands were as steady as a surgeon who had memorized every procedure. When he opened the envelope, the scent of paper and ink wafted in, accompanied by photographs that revealed something he had only suspected: Lara checking into a luxury hotel on 2 separate occasions, followed by Evan a few minutes later. There were no hugs, no recorded touches, but the shared time and place were enough to speak more truthfully than words. Daniel took a deep breath. "Okay," he whispered softly, not with heartbreak, but with an acknowledgement that the game had entered a new chapter. In the next photo, Daniel noticed something even more disturbing. Lara appeared to be meeting with her mother before leaving for the hotel. The two of them were talking with serious expressions, as if they were planning something. Daniel knew that expression well, not a casual discussion, but a strategy. He covered the photo with his fingertips, exhaling softly. "So, it's not just two people," he murmured. The realization didn't infuriate him, only sharpened his thinking. If Lara, Evan, and his wife's family were starting to play with a structured pattern, then he too would have to move with a neater, cleaner, deadlier pattern. Daniel didn't fight with emotion. He fought with structure. With a composure that kept his opponents from ever realizing they were losing. The next morning, Adrian arrived at Daniel's house. The two of them sat in the spacious living room, the morning light filtering through the sheer curtains and creating subtle reflections on the glass table. "This is solid evidence," Adrian said, examining Jordan's photos. "But if we're going to shut down their financial access, we have to do it without causing them to panic." Daniel nodded. "I don't want them to notice yet. Once everything is locked down, then we can make our move." Adrian regarded him with a mixture of respect and wariness. "You know, Dan, not many men can remain this calm when their marriage is being destroyed." Daniel raised his eyes slowly, his gaze clear and cold. "Calm doesn't mean I accept it. Calm means I choose the right time to act." Meanwhile, Lara hadn't noticed anything had changed. She was still preparing for the community meeting, dressed more elaborately than necessary, nervously checking her phone. Daniel watched her from a distance, putting on his watch, his face composed but his eyes taking in every little detail, the way she checked her screen without replying to a text, the way she repeatedly bit her lower lip as if afraid of being caught. "You're home late again tonight?" Daniel asked lightly. Lara smiled stiffly. "I guess." Daniel nodded. "Be careful on the road." There was no sarcasm, no accusation. Instead, the calmness made Lara duck her head slightly, like someone suddenly feeling watched by someone who never watches them. After Lara left, Daniel watched the door close and immediately moved to the study. He called Jordan. "Let's move on to the next step," Daniel said. "Follow her until she meets anyone tonight. Don't intervene. Just record." His voice was steady, as if he were giving business instructions, not ordering surveillance on his own wife. After calling Jordan, he dialed the main bank that held most of his personal assets. "Activate restructuring A," he said. Just 3 words, but his vast financial system began to move like a giant machine, slowly shutting off all outside access, especially from Lara's family name. In the corner of the room, the city lights began to flicker on one by one. Daniel stood behind the window, his silhouette calm, elegant, yet full of the intensity of a man taking back control of his life, and each step added another layer to the grand plan that was slowly closing in on those who betrayed him. Not with violence. Not with shouts. But with precision. A light rain fell when Daniel arrived at Marcus Vellman's office on this unplanned evening. The building was deserted, the lobby floor lit by soft lamps that cast long shadows on the marble. Marcus sat in his office, waiting, as if he knew Daniel would show up that very night. "You seem different," Marcus said, pouring 2 glasses of bourbon. Daniel took the glasses but didn't drink. "I didn't come to talk about feelings," he said quietly. "I need to check who might be involved in this game." Marcus leaned back, staring at his always calm friend, now cooler, more focused, like a man who had shed the last illusions of a home. Marcus pulled a file from a drawer, one he never opened except for serious matters. "This is Evan Mercer's internal records. There are some suspicious projects and trips," he said. Daniel flipped through the pages, looking at the dates that coincided with nights Lara had been late. His hand remained steady, but his breathing was slightly labored. "She used company money for a personal outing with my wife," Daniel said in a very low but sharp voice. Marcus nodded nervously. "Daniel, do you want me to stop her now?" Daniel closed the file and looked at his colleague with almost frightening calm. "No. Let her feel safe first." Daniel's phone vibrated softly, a message from Jordan Pierce, the detective. Target left the office for a new location. Not the previous hotel. Following. Daniel read the message without changing expression. Marcus watched him. "You really don't look angry," he said quietly. Daniel set the phone on the table. "Because anger is the greatest gift they can give. When I get angry, I lose control. And you know I never lose control." Marcus paused, the words held something darker, something that suggested Daniel had moved from suspicion to strategy. This man was no longer a wounded husband, he had become the architect of an elegant revenge. By the time Daniel left the building, the rain had stopped, but the streets remained wet and reflected the city lights. He walked slowly to his car, letting the cool night air touch his face. He hit speed dial. Jordan. His voice was low, steady. Send me your current location. From the other end, Jordan answered promptly. They stopped at a small restaurant in Riverside. A private table. They seemed to feel safe. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Stay at a distance. Don't intervene. After hanging up, he said to himself almost like a mantra he repeated to keep from getting carried away, patience is a sharp weapon if you know how to wield it. In the car, Daniel didn't start the engine right away. He sat quietly, staring out the window. His reflection was dim in the glass, a man who once wanted nothing more than a peaceful life, now slowly being reshaped by betrayal into a sharper, more calculating figure. If this is the path, he whispered, then I'll be the storm they thought would never come. His phone vibrated again, a photo from Jordan, Lara and Evan, sitting close together, hands almost touching, eyes locked like lovers no longer afraid of the world. Daniel didn't look away, didn't take a deep breath. He just watched, locked the image in his mind, and then put the phone away with a smooth motion. The next chapter had just begun. That morning, Daniel stood in front of the large mirror in his office, wearing the dark gray suit that always made him look like a man unflappable. But beneath that calm, his mind was working as fast as a war machine. The latest report from Julian arrived at 5 a.m, a photo of Evan and Lara entering a luxury boutique, laughing as if they never felt guilty about burning money that wasn't theirs. Daniel touched his phone screen, zooming in on one of the photos, Evan's hand clasped around Lara's waist, too intimate for a community meeting. Daniel didn't curse, didn't reprimand, just nodded once. So this is your game, he whispered softly. And a faint smile appeared on his face, the smile of a man beginning to see a complete map of the battlefield. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the office, but not for work as usual. He summoned Adrian Voss, his lawyer, to a private conference room. I want you to prepare 2 sets of documents, Daniel said, crossing his arms. If I want to file for divorce, and if I want to transfer all assets from joint names. Adrian paused for a moment, eyeing Daniel doubtfully. Are you sure about that? Daniel looked back at him, his eyes calm but sharp like glass, reflecting no emotion. I want to be ready. That's different from wanting to do it now. Adrian nodded, understanding Daniel's rhythm. The man didn't make decisions based on anger, he strategized based on total accuracy. Okay. Everything will be in order, Adrian replied, closing the folder respectfully. In the afternoon, Daniel received a text from Julian, target moving into Evan's rental apartment. Do you want me to keep following? Daniel stared at the message, swirling his coffee without drinking it. After a few seconds, he replied, no need. Focus on the digital evidence. Lara's phone. The hotel door footage. Daniel didn't need to know their every move minute by minute. What he needed was evidence that couldn't be denied in court, evidence that would destroy their little conspiracy without the need for raised voices or physical combat. After sending the message, Daniel leaned back. His inner calm remained, but a chill began to set in, the realization that the woman he once loved was now living in a world that didn't even recognize him anymore. That night, Lara returned home with slightly messy hair, a perfume that wasn't Daniel's, and a gait that couldn't lie. She tried to smile when she saw Daniel reading a book on the couch. Sorry. I'm late again, she said. Daniel closed the book slowly, his movements elegant as always. You look tired, he said softly. Lara swallowed, feeling judged without being judged, and that was all the more terrifying for her. Yeah, a lot of meetings. Daniel simply nodded, pausing as if to let the lie flow. Get some rest, he said. There was no hint, no emphasis. Lara walked to her room, but before closing the door, she glanced at Daniel, who was still sitting quietly on the couch. He seemed to know something. And his calm was a subtle yet sharp threat. As Lara's bedroom door closed, Daniel stood and walked to the study. He opened a digital folder containing Julian's chronology of evidence: hotel records, financial reports, boutique photos, wire transfer records, and a trail of messages. Everything was neatly organized in a chronological order, like a puzzle coming together. Daniel swiped through one photo, Lara smiling at Evan, a smile she hadn't given him in years. But instead of being crushed, Daniel locked the screen and smiled a small smile. "Thank you, Lara," he said quietly. "Because you showed me who I really deserved to leave behind." That night, he opened a new folder labeled Phase 2 Total Withdrawal of Control. And silently, Daniel Hale entered a new phase that would shake their lives, not with fury, but with deadly precision. That morning, Daniel sat in his office, staring at his laptop screen displaying a flowchart of his financial relationships, a map of the flow of funds he had never noticed before. The diagram, reconstructed by Jordan, revealed something deeper than mere infidelity, a neat, deliberate, and long-standing pattern. Lara wasn't just lying, she was using Daniel as her personal bank to finance Evan's lifestyle. Daniel massaged his temples, then said quietly to himself, "This isn't about feelings anymore. This is betrayal in its most naked form." As he closed the folder, there was a knock on the door. Adrian entered with a serious expression. "We need to talk," he said. Daniel nodded slowly. "I'm ready. Let's see how far this lie goes." Adrian sat across from Daniel, setting down some new documents. "Jordan found something else," he said, opening a folder. There was communication between Evan and two members of Lara's family, her sister, Miriam, and her cousin, Theo. Daniel wasn't surprised, but his eyes hardened slightly. "So they all knew?" Adrian sighed. "Not just knew. They helped cover it up." Daniel stared at the table, feeling something in his chest collapse but showing nothing but calm composure. "Her family played along," he murmured ironically. "I thought Evan was overly ambitious, but it turns out this was a collective project." Adrian stared at Daniel for a moment longer. "Are you okay?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I don't have time to be mean." Meanwhile, elsewhere, Lara sat in the hotel cafe with Miriam and Theo. Her expression was anxious, her fingers tapping the phone screen. "Daniel has been different lately," she said anxiously. Miriam took a sip of her drink with a sneer. "Come on, Lara. He's a good guy, too good. He won't suspect anything." Theo added dismissively, "Besides, Daniel never says no to anything. You just make up excuses." Lara bit her lip. "I don't know why. I feel like he's watching me," she said, barely a whisper. Miriam chuckled. "Men like him don't know anything." But of the three of them, only Lara felt something was right. Daniel did no more than they could have imagined. Meanwhile, Jordan called Daniel. "I have new footage," he said over the phone. The three of them met regularly. "And Evan used a hotel pass paid for from your household account." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the facts without wavering. "Send it all to Adrian," he said firmly. "I want every piece of evidence we have before I take the next step." Jordan paused, then said, "Daniel, a normal man would explode." "You wouldn't." Daniel just smiled faintly. "Explosions are loud. I prefer storms that are invisible until they destroy." There was a pause, a silence, as if the room held its breath. Daniel then added, "It's time for me to change the game." That night, Daniel sat alone in the living room. He stared at the room that had been a witness to his tranquility for years, now feeling like a solitary war planning center. He opened a leather notebook he rarely used, one reserved for the most important matters. He began to write, Stage 1, Asset Consolidation. Stage 2, Financial Freeze. Stage 3, Elegant Confrontation. He closed the notebook slowly, then looked at the photo of himself and Lara on the wall. Lara's smile in the photo felt like an insult now, not because it was fake, but because he had allowed himself to be deceived for too long. "Okay," she whispered. "Starting tonight, I lead the narrative." And with the composure of a king just beginning a war, Daniel rose from the sofa, ready to enter a darker but more certain chapter. That night the house felt quieter than usual, as if every wall was holding its breath, waiting for something to break between Daniel and Lara. Daniel sat in his study with the desk lamp softly lit, reading a file that no longer needed his attention. The door creaked, and Lara stood there nervous, as if wanting to say something but afraid to hear the answer herself. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice sounding like someone wanting to confess but not yet daring to name a sin. Daniel looked up, staring at her with a calmness that felt like a mirror forcing one to look at oneself without a filter. "About what?" he asked softly. Lara bit her lip, and for a moment, Daniel glimpsed the woman he had once loved, not the one now drowning in a lie he couldn't even carry gracefully. "I feel we're drifting apart," Lara said, stepping slowly into the room, her eyes never quite meeting Daniel's. She sat down in the chair across from him, fidgeting with her fingers. Daniel closed his file, leaned back, studying every little detail, the rapid breathing, the trembling voice, and the gaze that kept darting toward the door like someone wanting to flee. "Do you feel we're drifting apart?" Daniel repeated, his voice still soft but with a sharpness that made Lara pause. "Yes," she answered finally. "I feel like you're not the same as before. You're cold." He smiled faintly. "Cold doesn't mean distant, Lara. Sometimes cold just means someone is watching." The words made Lara stiffen, like someone realizing they're walking on thin ice. Lara opened her mouth, as if about to say something important, maybe a confession, maybe a new, bigger lie. But her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, and her face changed, a mix of panic and veiled fear. Daniel watched the change calmly, his eyes unblinking. "An important message?" he asked, his tone friendly yet deadly. Lara quickly turned off the screen. "No, just a regular group." Daniel nodded slowly. "I see." But his tone suggested he had been reading the gestures since before Lara realized it. There was a long pause, then Lara said, "You've been really getting on my nerves lately." Daniel looked at her gently. "I'm just being quiet. Sometimes silence is louder than shouting, Lara stood up abruptly, as if unable to bear the weight of the room. "I need some fresh air," she said, her voice cracking. Daniel nodded. "Sure." Lara walked hurriedly, like someone fleeing a conversation that was about to reveal a secret. As soon as her footsteps disappeared down the corridor, Daniel picked up his phone and opened Jordan's message that had just arrived. "They're planning a meeting tomorrow at Evan's apartment. I've got the camera and recording ready." Daniel closed the message without a change of expression. Then he looked at the door where Lara had disappeared. There, he had almost confessed. Almost. But lies that are too deep don't usually fall so easily, they crumble slowly, like an old building awaiting the final blow. Daniel stood and turned off the lights, leaving the study in the warm darkness. He walked to the large living room window, gazing out at the city glistening in the long night. "Tomorrow," he murmured softly. "Tomorrow I will have a full answer." There was no malice in his voice, only certainty. A calm man was not an unharmed man, he simply chose his wounds as fuel for his next move. And late that night, as Lara passed him again without daring to look at him, Daniel realized that this game was over. Not by lies, not by half-hearted confessions. The truth was coming, and neither of them was ready. A light rain fell as Daniel stood outside the window of his penthouse office, gazing out at the city gleaming like a giant chessboard. Each building seemed like a piece still, yet full of potential movement. He had just received the latest report from Jordan Price, which revealed a pattern of secret meetings between Evelyn, Evan, and even two members of Evelyn's family who had been acting sweetly in Daniel's presence. "So she's not the only one who betrayed me," Daniel murmured softly, his breathing measured. "They're all playing." There was no waver in his voice, instead, there was a chilling calm, like someone who had just seen the full picture of a game that had been hidden from him. Daniel twirled his wedding band briefly, then removed it from his finger for the first time. "Okay, then let's begin." Jordan entered the room cautiously, carrying a thick folder filled with photos and recordings. "They're getting more careless," Jordan said matter-of-factly. Daniel took the folder and leafed through it slowly, page by page. Photos of Evelyn smiling in the hotel lobby, Evan with his arm around her waist in the parking lot, and even more painfully silent, a photo of his mother-in-law receiving an envelope from Evan. Daniel showed no anger. "Greed is a predictable thing," he said calmly. Jordan stared at him, trying to read his thoughts. "Do you want me to continue monitoring or should we move on?" Daniel closed the folder, neatly laying it aside as if it weren't evidence of treason but a regular business report. "We've moved up a step. It's time for them to make a mistake, one we're directing." Daniel's first move was to move most of his liquid assets into a private trust account accessible only through dual authorization with his senior lawyer. He signed document after document with the calm of a master strategist. "If Evelyn tries to withdraw funds again without your permission," his lawyer asked. Daniel closed his pen and replied, "Let her. That's part of the plan." The lawyer understood. Daniel was waiting for the trap to close naturally. He didn't want conflict. He just wanted the truth to emerge, and he set the stage meticulously. Each signature was a tiny thread that would pull off the masks of those who betrayed him, one by one. That night, Evelyn came home, even more flamboyantly dressed than usual, the scent of expensive perfume filling the air. Daniel was preparing tea when the door opened. "You look tired," he said softly. She flinched slightly, as if his voice had come too close to her own thoughts. "It was a long meeting," she replied quickly. Daniel nodded, handing her a cup of tea. "I reset some of our accounts today," he said calmly, as if he were simply discussing the weather. Evelyn swallowed, barely perceptible. "Oh? For what?" Daniel gave her a long, gentle, yet piercing look. "To make sure everything stays safe." She forced a smile, but a cold sweat was already breaking out on the back of her neck. She knew something had changed, but she didn't know what. It scared her. After Evelyn entered the room, Daniel sat in the living room, staring at the door that had just closed. Jordan had texted, "They'd taken." Evelyn looked panicked after trying to log in to your account, access denied. Daniel typed a short reply, "Let her try again. I wonder who she contacts next." He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. Not because he was tired, but because he was planning his next move. On this board, Daniel was no longer the victim. He was the main player, moving his pieces with deadly calm. And Evelyn's every move would only further illuminate the truth he had been hiding. That night, Daniel sat in his office with the lights dimmed, the rain pattering against the window in a gentle, soothing, and threatening rhythm. Before him, Jordan's latest report unfolded, CCTV footage showing Lara and Evan entering a posh restaurant through a back door, as if they were hiding something that even the headlights shouldn't touch. Daniel played the footage expressionlessly, just staring intently at every small gesture, Evan's hand touching Lara's back, the smile she'd never seen again at home. In that moment, it wasn't his heart that was broken, it was his hope in the integrity of someone he once trusted. "You really chose this path, Lar," he whispered softly. As Daniel closed his laptop, there was a gentle knock on the office door. Marcus appeared, his face a mixture of worry and awe. "Jordan said things were developing quickly," he said carefully. Daniel nodded, turning his wedding ring slowly, a habit that developed when his mind was working hard. "The sooner the truth comes out, the sooner I can get this over with." Marcus sat across the table, staring at Daniel with a serious tone. "Not many men can remain this calm." Daniel smiled faintly. "Calmness isn't an option. It's the only way to stay winning." The two men stared at each other in silence, understanding that this evening was no longer just an investigation, it had entered the realm of psychological warfare. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Lara was in an exclusive bar lit only by candlelight. She sat across from Evan, her face troubled, though she tried to hide it. "Daniel's getting weird," Lara said, squeezing her wine glass. Evan smiled dismissively. "He's busy with his business. He won't suspect anything." Lara looked away, but Evan's words weren't reassuring. There was a fear she didn't recognize, fear of Daniel's composure, of the way he always seemed to know more than he let on. Evan touched her hand. "Trust me." Lara nodded, though her eyes betrayed no trust. Behind her smile, she began to realize that she might have misjudged her husband. As Lara and Evan left the bar, Jordan watched from a distance, blending into the crowd like an invisible shadow. He picked up his phone and snapped a few photos before sending them directly to Daniel. It took Daniel only 3 seconds to open the message, staring silently at the two figures walking too close, too intimate, too oblivious to anything but themselves. Daniel didn't grit his teeth or clench his fists, he simply tilted his head, taking in every detail. "Thank you, Jordan. Keep going," he wrote simply. Jordan smiled a little, not sarcastically, but in awe. Daniel was no ordinary client. He was a slow-moving but steady storm. At home, Daniel hung up his phone and stood facing the large living room window. The city lights shimmered like 1,000 secrets scattered in the distance. Silently, he felt something he hadn't in weeks: the limits of his patience were shifting. Not from pain, but from the growing clarity of where the game was heading. "If this is the path you choose, then I will end it in a way you will never forget," he whispered, not a threat, but the simple statement of a man who had given up hope and begun to act. Beneath the calm, Daniel Hale's storm was finally beginning to take shape. Lara's footsteps were soft as she entered the house that afternoon, her face showing a nervousness she tried to mask with a soft smile, a smile that no longer fooled Daniel. She was standing in the living room, closing the documents Marcus had just sent. "You're home early," Lara said, trying to match her tone. Daniel glanced at her briefly, his eyes soft but full of a clarity he could no longer hide. "Just wanted to be home," he replied neutrally. Lara swallowed, finding his calmness far more frightening than any emotional outburst. She approached, but Daniel took a step toward the kitchen, a small distance that felt like a large, newly formed wall. Lara set down her bag, trying to make small talk. "Are you busy?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel opened the refrigerator, grabbed a water, and closed it slowly. "No. Just making sure a few things are running smoothly." His answer was simple, yet it carried an unseen firmness. Lara noticed the way he set the glass down, slowly, precisely, without a single excess movement. It was the gesture of a man who had finished hoping, but hadn't yet started a war, a man processing his wounds with an elegant yet dangerous way. "Is there something you want to talk about?" Lara asked, trying to take control of the situation. Daniel looked at her, a small, unwarranted smile appearing. Later. That afternoon, Daniel received a text from Jordan. "Evan is going to his family's house. I'll send the full recording tonight." Daniel replied curtly, then deleted the message. Lara watched from a distance, pretending to be busy with her phone. "Who?" she asked casually, but her voice wasn't natural. "Client," he replied. "Things have changed lately." Lara chuckled, a laugh that tried to sound lighthearted but sounded like the cracking of glass. "Yes, things have changed." Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on Lara as if he were reading a page he had long since neglected. For the first time, Lara felt herself no longer the control center, but someone being closely observed. As night fell, Daniel entered his office without a word. Lara stood in the hallway, about to knock but hesitant. Daniel sat at his desk, leafing through the files Marcus had prepared: the fund blocking plan, the card termination documents, the revised prenuptial agreement, and Jordan's report, which grew thicker each night. They all fit together neatly like a puzzle, beginning to reveal a complete picture. "This isn't revenge," Daniel muttered to himself. "This is reorganization." He signed a file, his movements subtle but final. On the other side of the door, Lara heard the tapping of a pen and felt a sense of dread unlike anything she had ever felt in her life. Lara finally knocked softly. "Daniel, can we talk?" Daniel closed the file, turning his chair slowly. "Sure," he said. Lara walked in hesitantly. "I feel you're pulling away." Daniel studied her face, the face of the woman he loved, but now coated with layers of lies he'd allowed to grow for too long. "I'm not pulling away, Lar," he replied quietly. "I'm just starting to understand." Lara felt her body weaken. "Understand what?" Daniel stood, staring at her without anger, only a truth too sharp to deny. That sometimes, the people we protect the most are the ones who are the furthest from the truth. Lara was speechless. In that silence, Daniel stepped past her and left the room. The door closed softly, but his voice sounded like a declaration that the storm was now officially moving. The rain fell softly that night, tapping on Daniel's penthouse window like a subtle rhythm that signaled that something big was approaching. Daniel stood at his desk, looking at the latest photos Jordan had sent, Lara and Evan entering a private restaurant, Lara sitting too close, Evan touching the back of his hand as if Daniel had never existed. But this time, what Daniel noticed was no longer Lara's betrayal, it was a pattern. Where they met, who they contacted, even who they paid. "You guys are so reckless," he said quietly, his tone low but full of irony. Daniel picked up his glass of whiskey and took a thin sip. It wasn't a night of heartbreak. It was a night of observation before the attack. Jordan arrived 15 minutes later, his raincoat dripping wet from the storm's aftermath. He set a flash drive on the table. "These are recordings from the last 2 days," he said. Daniel nodded. "What about Lara's family?" Jordan pulled out a chair and sat down, his face serious. "Involved. They knew about the relationship, and it seems they helped cover it up." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, not out of surprise, but because he realized the circle of betrayal was much larger than one person. "Okay," he said finally. "Then the game has officially changed." Daniel's tone remained soft, but there was a mysterious decisiveness behind every word. Jordan stared at him, understanding that the man before him was planning an irreversible move. Daniel swiveled his chair and stared at the large screen on the wall, displaying the financial reports he had neatly compiled. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a series of seemingly small but very frequent transactions. "They're using my money to finance meetings, trips, and whatever." Jordan shook his head. "Insolent." Daniel gave a small, mirthless smile. "Not insolent, stupid. They think I'm not watching what's mine." He flipped to the next file, revealing a diagram of the cash flow he had locked and rerouted. "Starting tomorrow, not a single dollar will be accessible to them. We'll see how this illicit relationship survives without a sponsor." The tone wasn't vindictive. It was justice orchestrated with heavenly precision and hellish calm. A moment later, Daniel's phone rang, Lara's name flashed on the screen. He let it ring for a long moment before picking up. "Where are you?" Lara's voice sounded tense, like someone afraid something had changed, because it had. "Home," he replied calmly. "Are you home?" There was a moment of silence before Lara answered, "Maybe a little late." Daniel smiled faintly at Jordan. "It's okay," he said softly into the phone. "Just enjoy your time." Lara paused, as if recognizing a tone that no longer belonged to her husband. "Daniel, what's wrong with you?" Daniel stared at the dark window, then answered almost in a whisper, "I'm just learning to see more clearly." He hung up before Lara could respond. Jordan was stunned. Daniel just shrugged. Sometimes, simple words are the sharpest daggers. After the call ended, Daniel stood and grabbed his long black coat. "Shall we go?" Jordan asked. Daniel nodded. "It's time I saw for myself how they lie when they think no one is watching." They headed for the private elevator, which opened with a soft thud. As the doors closed, Daniel's image was reflected on the metal walls, calm, collected. "Remember," he said to Jordan, "we're not making any noise tonight. We're just taking notes." The elevator descended into the darkness of the night, where the truth began to reveal itself like a wound that could no longer be hidden. Daniel was no longer a wounded man. He was now a man preparing to close the book of betrayal page by page, with a silent power far more dangerous than anger. That morning, Daniel stood in front of his office's large window, gazing out at the buildings bathed in the cold sunlight. He had just received a comprehensive report from Jordan: photographs, audio recordings, hidden transactions, even Lara and Evan's secret travel logs over the past few months. "This is neater than I expected," Daniel murmured softly as he opened the thick folder containing the evidence. Adrian stood beside him, noting Daniel's expression remained peaceful, too peaceful for someone holding the evidence of his broken marriage. "You don't have to hold back, Dan," Adrian said carefully. Daniel closed the folder slowly. "I'm not holding anything back. I'm just making sure every step I take is perfect." Adrian took a deep breath before speaking again. "If you want, We can file the asset freeze petition tonight. Daniel shook his head slowly. Not yet. Everything has to be scheduled. He walked over to the desk, opened his laptop, and brought up a secret calendar that only he and Adrian had access to. There were small markers indicating important dates: when Evan would be attending a company gala, when Lara's family would be gathering, and when major media outlets would be conducting independent audits. I want them to fall, not stumble, Daniel said. They need to think this is all their own doing. Adrian stared at him with a mixture of respect and horror, because Daniel's calm was starting to feel like a storm whose every turn had been calculated. That afternoon, Jordan entered the room with the final piece of evidence, a black flash drive. "This is what you asked for," he said, setting it on the table. Daniel stared at him, one eyebrow raised. "The hotel conversation?" Jordan nodded. "And more. There's video, pretty clear." They weren't careful. Daniel took the drive without a change of expression. While most men would have crumbled at the sight of such evidence, Daniel seemed to stand taller, more determined. "Good," he said. "The complete truth is the cleanest weapon." Jordan looked at him in surprise. "You aren't angry?" Daniel smiled a small, eye-splitting smile. "Anger is crude. I prefer precision." That night, Daniel returned home with a light step, as if carrying no burden. Lara was sitting on the couch, pretending to be watching a play. "You're home early," she said, a little surprised. Daniel put down his jacket and sat down next to her quietly. "Just felt like going home early." Lara smiled stiffly. "I have another community event tomorrow." Daniel nodded, as if believing it. "Sure. Do what you think is important." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Lara looked uneasy because Daniel's smile was too gentle, too patient, too knowing something he wasn't saying. But Daniel wasn't confrontational. He just observed. And that night, Lara fell asleep earlier than usual, while Daniel sat in his study silently preparing his next move. When the house was completely silent, Daniel contacted Adrian and Jordan on a conference call that lasted only a few minutes. "Phase 2 of the plan begins tomorrow," Daniel said calmly. "We target Marcus first. If he falters, Evan will fall with him." Jordan nodded from the screen. Adrian added, "And after that?" "Lara?" Daniel paused before answering. "No. Lara is not a target. She is merely a consequence of her own choices." After the call ended, Daniel turned off all the lights except one, the desk lamp that cast a soft but harsh light on his face. Phase 1 was complete. And now, for the first time, Daniel's elegant game of revenge truly began. That morning, Daniel stood on his office balcony overlooking downtown, holding a cup of coffee he had barely touched. The past few days had been too quiet, too orderly, and Daniel knew that such quiet was usually the quiet of someone hiding something. When Jordan sent him a brief report detailing Evan and Lara's increasingly structured movement patterns, Daniel smiled faintly. "They're starting to be cautious," he murmured, "which means they're starting to get scared." Daniel's calm wasn't one of resignation, it was the calm of a sophisticated man who knew the entire chessboard was now moving according to his calculations. He looked back at the city, feeling the noise of the world below him, but the noise itself made the lies more visible. Jordan arrived at the office carrying a small, seemingly ordinary drive, but Daniel knew its contents were more than simple. They sat in his private office, the door closed, the lights dimmed like a secret scene in a movie. They started meeting in noisier locations, Jordan said, setting the drive down on the desk. Crowded restaurants, fancy gyms, lounges filled with loud music. Places where they thought they could disguise their interactions. Daniel nodded slowly. Noise is a terrible blanket for nervous people. He inserted the drive into his laptop and saw the first footage, Lara and Evan, sitting too close in a lounge, their gestures subtle, but their eyes unfailing. Daniel didn't move, betrayed no emotion, he just stared, absorbing, calculating. One recording caught Daniel's attention. Evan handed Lara a small box, amidst fake laughter and bar lights too glamorous for something called a community meeting. Lara opened it, a thin gold bracelet, and the expression on her face was a mixture of guilt and euphoria. Daniel replayed the recording over and over, not to hurt himself, but to understand. She's no longer hesitating, he said quietly. She's too far into Evan's circle. Jordan looked at him with a hint of worry. You're still calm. Daniel closed his laptop gently. When someone chooses the path of betrayal, they also choose their own end. I just followed the line to the end. That afternoon, Marcus arrived with additional legal information, not for Daniel, but because Daniel had asked him to pose as a financial advisor to Lara's extended family. In the conference room, Marcus placed a thick folder on the table. Her family has also started receiving funds from Evan. Small payments, but regular. Daniel stared at the document without changing expression. They're all in the same game, he said quietly, and they think they're doing it quietly. Marcus rubbed his face, half stressed, half amazed. You've really prepared the quietest war I've ever seen. Daniel sighed lightly. War doesn't have to be loud, March. The loud ones usually lose first. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel rewatched all the footage Jordan had collected. He wasn't a man who enjoyed tormenting himself with evidence, he was simply making sure that every step he took would be built on a foundation no one could shake. When the final recording ended, Daniel turned off the screen and stared at his reflection in the window. Next step, he whispered. It wasn't a whisper of revenge, nor was it one of anger, it was the whisper of someone who knew the time had come to act. The truth was complete. Their lies were complete. Now it was Daniel's turn to make the silence speak loudest. That night, rain fell softly, wetting the large windows of Daniel's apartment like lines of ink rewriting fate before him. From his high floor, the city looked like a sea of cold light. Daniel held a glass of red wine, not to drink, but to keep his hands busy and his mind clear. He had just received the latest report from Jordan, Evan's secret meeting, new evidence of the flow of transactions into Lara's family account, and recorded conversations that revealed the depth of the betrayal. But what made Daniel pause wasn't the evidence. It was a single sentence from Jordan, someone in your family is approaching Evan. Daniel closed his eyes. His enemies were growing, and closer than he had imagined. Jordan arrived shortly after, his coat damp, his hair a little messy, a rare sight for him. There's something you should see, he said, placing a small flash drive on the glass table. Daniel turned it gently between his fingers before inserting it into the laptop. The screen displayed footage from a fancy restaurant, Evan sitting with a middle-aged man, Lara's uncle, Harold. Daniel leaned forward, focusing on Harold's anxious yet enthusiastic expression, as if he were plotting for a future that wasn't his. He wants a share of Evan's investment, Jordan explained. In exchange, he's helping to pressure you within Lara's family. Daniel sighed softly, not from surprise, but because everything was now starting to fit together like pieces of a puzzle badly assembled by greedy hands. Their motive was simple, Jordan continued, opening another file. They thought you were too stable. Too strong. Not easily manipulated. Daniel drummed his fingers on the table. And they chose Evan? Jordan nodded. He's easily flattered, hungry for recognition, and looking to prove himself through shortcuts. Daniel stared at Evan's picture on the screen, a handsome young man with eyes full of cheap ambition. Ironic, Daniel said quietly. They chose someone they thought could replace me. But they forgot, ability can't be faked like a smile. Jordan smiled a small smile, a rare one. They really didn't know you were 3 steps ahead. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Not 3. 5. When Jordan left, the apartment fell silent again. Daniel sat in front of his laptop, staring at the footage of Harold and Evan once more. What he felt wasn't anger, but a strange relief. The truth, no matter how strong, was always better than ignorance. He turned his chair to face the large window, looking at his own reflection, calm, composed, and unwavering. He knew what was coming wasn't just a confrontation between husband, wife, and mistress. It would be a battle of influence, reputation, and social games far more cruel than the betrayal itself. And Daniel was ready. Not as a victim, not as a broken man, but as someone who knew how to close a chapter without leaving a single trace of his hurt. In the silence, Daniel's phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "We need to talk. It's about Lara." Daniel stared at the message for a long moment, reading the lingering fear behind the short words. It wasn't Evan, it wasn't Harold, and it wasn't any of Lara's family. A second message came in. "I can't let them ruin your life. I'll meet you tomorrow, at 3. Don't tell anyone." Daniel turned off the phone and grabbed his jacket. While many fear secrets, Daniel embraced them. Because he knew, the darker the truth, the brighter the path to ending it gracefully. And tomorrow, he would find out who the unexpected ally who had decided to stand by his side was. That night, Daniel stood alone on the balcony of his high-rise apartment, gazing out at the city, which shimmered like a sea of mechanical lights. The night breeze carried the scent of rain, permeating his crisp black suit. The day had been long, too long, but each piece of the puzzle was coming into focus. Marcus sent the final documents to execute the termination of the funds, Jordan sent a new set of photos, and Evelyn's personal financial statements revealed a pattern that was increasingly impossible to make sense of. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Not because he was tired, but because the calm was beginning to give way to something sharper, colder, more certain. "The truth," he murmured, "is just waiting to surface." Jordan arrived promptly at 9, knocking on the door in the short rhythm they had agreed upon earlier. Daniel opened it and let him in without another word. Jordan placed a thick black folder on the living room glass table. "This, everything. Hotel records, text messages, transaction history, their meeting locations, even the accidentally recorded voice conversations." Daniel didn't immediately touch the folder. He just stared at it like he was staring at the climax of a movie he already knew the ending to. "How strong?" Daniel asked quietly. Jordan took a breath. "If this goes to court, Evelyn and Evan won't just lose, they'll be destroyed." Daniel nodded calmly. "Okay. Now it's time to move on to the next chapter." When Daniel opened the folder, every photo, every note, and every audio piece of evidence didn't tear at his heart, it instead confirmed a decision that had been brewing in silence for a long time. In one photo, Evelyn was laughing with Evan in a private restaurant, wearing a bracelet purchased from Daniel's own account. In another recording, Evelyn's voice was clearly audible as she spoke derogatorily of Daniel and his family. Jordan looked at Daniel anxiously, afraid he would finally break down. But Daniel simply closed the folder slowly, straightened his back, and said, "I'm not looking for excuses anymore. I'm looking for the truth to resolve." His voice was so calm that it gave Jordan goosebumps. Meanwhile, in the mansion that now felt increasingly unfamiliar, Evelyn was preparing to leave. She checked her phone repeatedly, making sure she had read Evan's message, "Everything will be fine. I'm working on your account." Evelyn smiled faintly, believing Evan was a shortcut to a more glamorous, freer life. She never knew that Daniel had already cut off all financial access she thought was still secure. She didn't know that Evan himself was frantic, searching for a way to cover up the scandal that was about to explode. Evelyn knew only one thing: she thought she had one. And that made her impending downfall feel all the more cruel and deserved. As Jordan left the apartment, Daniel stood by the large window again. Rain had begun to fall, reflecting the city lights off the glass. Daniel stared at his reflection, the man who had once been patient, gentle, and understanding, now someone who took complete control without the need for a raised voice or threats. Tomorrow, Daniel thought, this circle will begin to close. He picked up his phone and texted Marcus, "Prepare for the final stage. We start tomorrow morning." There was no hesitation. No trembling in his hands. Just the absolute calm of a man who had finally stopped holding back. And for whoever had betrayed him, that was the most terrifying moment. That morning, Daniel sat quietly in his office, staring at the stacks of files he had been organizing for months. There was no chaos in his preparations, everything was clean, structured, and layered like the strategy of a war maestro who never made a move without calculation. Jordan entered with an additional folder. "New evidence," he said. Daniel nodded, opening the folder. Inside were photos of Lara and Evan entering a private apartment that had never appeared in Evan's records. "They finally stopped being so cautious," Daniel said quietly. Jordan nodded, then looked at Daniel in admiration. You're not shaking at all. Daniel stared at the photo emotionlessly. I haven't been shaking since the day I discovered the first truth. Meanwhile, in the living room, Lara checked her phone repeatedly. Messages from Evan poured in quickly. Don't panic. We're safe. But the more she read, the more her heart trembled. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his steps calm, his face as peaceful as ever. You look nervous, he said softly. Lara flinched, hiding her phone. Just community business, he replied hastily. Daniel almost smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who knows more than his opponent. I'm going out for a moment, he said. I have something to finish. Lara nodded, but her gaze followed Daniel warily, as if she sensed the wall she had built slowly beginning to crack. Daniel walked steadily to Marcus Fellman's office. When he arrived, Marcus was waiting with a serious expression. I've read all the documents you sent, Marcus said. Daniel sat down, crossing his legs calmly. Do you understand what I need? Marcus nodded. You want complete control of the assets and you want the cleanest possible termination. Daniel looked at him. Without a scandal. Marcus leaned forward. You have enough evidence to win in court without a single word of concern, Daniel. Daniel replied quietly, I don't want to win the war. I just want to come out of it with honor. That afternoon, Jordan texted Daniel, target moving. Secret apartment. Ready? Daniel, who was in the car, replied with only one word, continue. He arrived at a luxury building that looked like a typical executive residence, but Daniel knew better. From a distance, he saw Jordan scanning the lobby with a small hidden camera. They're in there, Jordan said quietly. Daniel stared at the building's entrance for a long moment, his face emotionless. I don't need to see them, he said calmly. The important thing is to have enough evidence. But beneath the calm was a storm he hadn't shown, a storm he had been controlling with inhuman discipline. As night fell, Daniel returned home, his steps slower than usual. He saw Lara sitting on the couch, pretending to read a magazine. You've been out a while, she said, trying to sound casual. He responded softly. I have some things to take care of. Silence. Silence. Then Daniel looked at her, his gaze too peaceful for a man who was being betrayed. Lara, he said slowly, if there's something you need to say, you can say it. Lara froze. Nothing, he replied, too quickly. Daniel only smiled faintly, a smile that made Lara's chest tighten. And that night, as she watched his retreating back, Lara felt, for the first time, afraid. Not because she'd been caught. But because Daniel Hale was no longer a man who could be easily deceived. The next morning, Daniel sat at the spacious but empty breakfast table, accompanied only by the soft clatter of cutlery and the aroma of strong black coffee. He read Adrian's legal papers with an almost inhuman calm, as if the entire storm that lay ahead were just a gentle breeze passing by his ears. When Lara appeared on the stairs, her eyes were swollen, her face pale but filled with a forced arrogance. We need to talk, she said in an unsteady voice. Daniel closed the documents slowly, his movements controlled. Sure, he replied, his voice soft but undiluted. I always have time for honest conversation. Lara paused, for the word honest was like a silent whip that stabbed right into the heart of her defenses. I feel, you're pulling away, Lara said, trying to articulate an emotion that sounded more like a scenario she'd spent the night preparing. Daniel looked at her, not with anger, but with the gaze of a man who'd gone too far in the game. I'm not pulling away, he said softly. I'm just stopping chasing something that no longer wants to stay. Lara gritted her teeth, a veiled panic rising. You're talking like I'm guilty. Daniel raised an eyebrow slowly, a simple gesture, but enough to throw Lara off her feet. I'm not calling anyone guilty, he said. But facts usually don't need a defense. Lara hated that composure. Because Daniel's composure wasn't just an attitude, it was a prison that locked away all the lies he was hiding. As Lara turned and headed for the kitchen to make coffee, Daniel noticed her movements, hurried, anxious, like someone desperately trying to appear normal. Lara's phone vibrated on the table. The name flashed, Evan Mercer. In a split second, Daniel saw the blood drain from her face. It's nothing, Lara said quickly, almost running to get it. Daniel leaned back in his chair and watched without cheering, without sarcasm, just waiting. You can answer it, he said in a voice too casual for the situation. There's nothing to hide, is there? Lara stood still, her phone clenched tightly. It was silent, but not just any silence. It was a silence that exploded without a sound. Instead of answering, Lara turned off the phone and fixed her hair reflexively. I have to leave early today, she said, crafting an excuse that even her own voice didn't believe. Daniel stood slowly, then walked past the breakfast table with a calm stride that made Lara tense. He stopped right next to her, not touching her, just looking at her sideways. Go, he said softly. Do whatever you need to do. Lara swallowed. The words felt like a large door opening, but not to free her. For the first time, Lara felt small in front of Daniel, not because of the volume of his voice, but because she realized he was no longer in the same game. He was already 5 moves ahead. After Lara left, Daniel returned to his study. Jordan texted, "The new recording is ready. It's enough to break all the lies." Daniel typed a short reply, "Send it to Adrian." It was time for a new chapter to begin. He closed his phone and stood at the window, watching the city slowly awaken. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something almost like a sigh of relief, not because he was happy, but because the falsehood was finally coming apart. Silence, he murmured, is often the deadliest weapon. He took a sip of his coffee, which was starting to cool. It was no ordinary day. It was the point when the game turned completely, and this time, Daniel held all the pieces. That morning, the city skyline looked like cracked glass, gray, cold, and filled with an invisible pressure. Daniel sat in his office staring at his cold coffee, his thoughts not on the taste but on the rhythm of the clock ticking away to the big confrontation. Before him, the files compiled by Marcus and Jordan had now morphed into a complete map of Lara and Evan's betrayal, transaction evidence, hotel recordings, secret messages, and even evidence of Lara's family's involvement in cynically plundering Daniel's funds. There were moments when Daniel asked himself if there was still room for anger or sadness, but all that remained was clarity. The clarity of a man who had seen the whole truth, and chosen to handle it with elegance, coolness, and deliberation. Today wasn't about revenge, today was about taking back his life. When Jordan arrived, he brought something even Daniel hadn't expected to see so soon, a recording of a conversation between Lara, Evan, and Lara's sister, shamelessly discussing how they had been milking Daniel. Lara's voice on the recording sounded unfamiliar, cruel, manipulative, and a far cry from the woman who had once lain on his chest, telling him stories of the future. He'll never realize it. Daniel's too good, too trusting, Lara said on the recording, accompanied by Evan's exasperated laugh. Jordan turned off the phone, giving Daniel room to breathe, though Daniel remained expressionless. I thought you'd want to hear it, Jordan said quietly. Daniel stared at the recording for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Perfect, he said, without a hint of a tremor. Now's the time. Marcus followed shortly after, carrying the final draft of the legal strategy. He calmly explained how Daniel was now in a position of absolute victory, the estate secure, the assets transferred cleanly, the evidence of the affair ironclad, the family fraud complete, and none of it unchallenged in court. You can take them down any time. If you want, it'll be over tomorrow, Marcus said, closing his file folder. Daniel stood, straightened his jacket, and stared at his reflection in the mirror. Tomorrow isn't the time, he replied quietly. I want them destroyed by the truth, not by anger. Marcus smiled slightly, nodding in understanding. Not many men could stand this strong after such a deep betrayal. Daniel Hale was no ordinary man. Meanwhile, Lara was at her parents' house unaware that her life was slowly crumbling. Ironically, it was there that the latest recordings were being made, Lara's family discussing Daniel's money, how they could ask for more, how Evan should be more aggressive about securing the future, and how Lara should make sure Daniel felt guilty if he ever became suspicious. In the recordings, Lara said in a flat voice, he's too soft. Daniel won't fight back. He doesn't have that courage. Jordan listened to the recordings with Daniel. When that line came through, Daniel only raised an eyebrow slightly. Interesting, they think I don't have the courage, he said, closing his laptop. I guess they don't really know me. That night, Daniel stood on the balcony of his high-rise apartment, gazing out at the city that shimmered like 1,000 secrets that never slept. All the pieces of the puzzle were now complete, all the evidence was in his hands. Lara, Evan, and his wife's side of the family were now in a position where they could no longer emerge unscathed. But Daniel didn't want blood, he wanted clarity. He wanted a clean slate. Tomorrow, he said to himself, his voice soft but sharp. Tomorrow it all begins. And as the night breeze touched his face, Daniel knew, he was no longer the man they had once exploited. He was now a force moving silently, and tomorrow, everyone's masks would finally crack. That night, Daniel sat alone in his study, the room that had been the silent headquarters for all his revenge preparations for months. The desk lamp illuminated the neatly arranged documents, recordings of Lara's calls with Evan, photos of them at the hotel, records of the shady transactions that flowed from Daniel's account to their lavish lifestyle. Jordan had just left after submitting a final report so comprehensive it left no room for the slightest lie. Daniel closed the final folder with a slow, almost ritualistic motion. "This is your last night playing behind my back," he murmured quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just the cold certainty of a man who had been silent for too long. At home, Lara felt an unease she couldn't quite explain. Daniel hadn't been saying much lately, and his silence was sharper than any question. She paced the bedroom, phone in hand, waiting for Evan's increasingly infrequent messages. A small part of her was starting to feel scared, not because her lie had been discovered, but because Daniel seemed too calm. He must just be busy, Lara whispered to herself, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. When Daniel's footsteps sounded downstairs, her body tensed involuntarily. Daniel walked up the stairs with a determined stride, carrying a large envelope, an envelope that would change the course of their entire lives. When he entered the room, Lara smiled with obvious effort. "Are you working late?" she asked, almost too cheerfully. Daniel looked at her with unreadable eyes. "No. I'm just finishing up something I've been putting off." He set the envelope down on the dresser. "We need to talk, Lar." Two words that anyone who keeps secrets dreads. Lara swallowed. "About what?" Daniel didn't sit down, nor did he come any closer. "About what's really happened over the past 4 months." Lara's smile faded instantly, like a candle in a cold wind. Lara tried to play it cool. "I don't understand, Daniel." But Daniel opened the envelope, pulling out the photos Jordan had taken, photos of her and Evan in hotels, restaurants, places she shouldn't have been without her husband. Lara paled. "It's not like that," Daniel interrupted, his voice soft but like a knife sheathed in silk. "I've known for a long time. I was just waiting for you to stop lying to yourself." Lara's tears sprang to life, filled with panic, not regret. "Daniel, I can explain," but Daniel shook his head slowly. "I don't want explanations. I want honesty. Unfortunately, you never chose that." As Lara covered her face and sobbed, Daniel took a deep breath, a breath that signaled the end of his waiting and the beginning of the final phase of the plan he had been building with incredible patience. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to ask you to go to Marcus's office," he said quietly. "We'll finish this gracefully. No scandal, unless you force it." Lara looked up, her eyes swollen. "Are you serious?" Daniel stared at her, his gaze pained yet graceful and collected. "I never played with my life, Lar." "You did." Then he walked out of the room, leaving Lara to cry alone, but not from the loss of love, but from the realization that the game she had been playing had finally reached its limit. The private conference room on the top floor of Hale Tower that night felt like the final stage of a play that had been played out in secret for too long. Daniel sat calmly at the head of a long glass table, his black suit immaculately clean without a single wrinkle, while Adrian tidied up the files that would become a deadly legal spear. Jordan Pierce stood behind them, holding a tablet containing recordings that would destroy Evan's name in a matter of minutes. Daniel glanced toward the still-closed door. "Tonight," he said, his voice low but sharp, "we'll finish this game without raising our voices." Adrian nodded. "Evan will come." And you'll know the real him. Daniel sighed softly. I've known him for a long time. I'm just letting him show his true colors first. The door finally opened. Evan entered with a false, almost comical confidence, accompanied by two of his family members who had been the mouthpieces for the gossip that had been hurting Daniel from behind. Evan tried to smile. Daniel, I heard you wanted to talk about our partnership, but his voice wavered when he saw Daniel's overly calm face. Sit down, Daniel said without looking at him. Lara appeared a few seconds later, summoned by Adrian's text, and her face drained of color when she saw who was in the room. What is this? She asked, almost whispering. Daniel looked at her finally, not with anger, but judgment. The end of what you started. Daniel gestured, and Jordan played the first recording, Evan and Lara in the car, talking about how Daniel is too busy and too easy to take advantage of, then the second, Lara's family whispering in the dining room about how just take what you can before he wakes up. Lara covered her mouth, her body trembling. Daniel. I can explain. No, Daniel interrupted softly. You explained everything on the tape. Evan began to pale, seeing his reputation crumbling in front of the two family mentors he had once been so proud of. This isn't legal, it's all on public record. And you know better than anyone that I didn't commit a crime. I was just observing. Daniel's tone was so calm it was more piercing than a scream. Daniel stood slowly, taking the file from Adrian. This, he said, placing a red folder in front of Evan, is a complete summary of the evidence: misappropriation of funds, collusion, defamation, and attempted asset acquisition through emotional deception. Evan stared at the folder like it was a live bomb. Daniel, listen to me. Daniel glared at him. I've been listening to you for months. Now you listen to me. All your access has been blocked since this morning. All the transfers you made have been recorded and retracted. Lara sobbed. You set us up? Daniel sighed. No, Lar. You set yourself up. I'm just waiting for the moment when you stop lying even to yourself. The room fell into a piercing silence. Daniel looked at them all in turn, his face devoid of anger, devoid of resentment, just the firmness of a man finally taking back his life. Starting tonight, he said, our relationship is over. Personally. Financially. Morally. He made a small gesture to Jordan, who then opened the door, as if dismissing the bad actors from the final stage of their drama. Evan tried to speak, but no sound came out. Lara stared at Daniel, her eyes filled with a belated panic. You're really leaving us? Daniel grabbed his jacket, staring out the gleaming city window. I'm not leaving anyone, Lar. You're the ones who chose to walk away from where I stand. Then he walked out of the room, calm, upright, and finally free from the storm he had so long silently controlled. That morning, the air downtown felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if the great storm that had been weighing on Daniel's life for months was finally beginning to subside. With Adrian and Jordan, he stood in front of the family courthouse, awaiting the arrival of Lara, who had become a shadow of herself. When the black car pulled up and Lara stepped out, she was no longer the graceful woman who had once filled Daniel's days. Her eyes were filled with anxiety, her face devoid of confidence. Daniel, can we talk first, right? She pleaded, her voice unsteady. Daniel shook his head gently, elegantly, and unshaken. We've talked, Lar. Today, we're finishing this. Her words weren't hateful, they were all the more hurtful, coming from someone who was done feeling everything. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was quieter than a church. The judge opened the file, while Evan's lawyer sat, his face pale, as if he had just realized he was holding the ticket to his client's ruin. Jordan laid out a folder filled with evidence collected over the weeks: hotel recordings, conversations, secret fund distributions, even a video of Lara's family arranging the distribution of Daniel's money. Everything is going smoothly, Adrian murmured, almost like a commentary on a perfectly written thriller. Lara looked down, her shoulders trembling subtly. Evan, on the other hand, closed his eyes, as if expecting the world to swallow him. Daniel remained seated, still, composed, like a man who had shed a burden without having to step on anyone. When the opportunity to speak was granted, Lara stood up, her hands trembling. Daniel. I was wrong. I know. But you were also wrong because you were too perfect to the point where I felt like I was never enough. The sentence hung awkwardly, like an empty excuse floating in the air without direction. Daniel looked at her with eyes that were no longer full of love, but not full of hatred either. I never demanded perfection from you. Only your honesty. The atmosphere in the room changed. Even the judge stared at Daniel a little longer, as if realizing that he had not only won the legal case, but also won himself. Lara closed her mouth, at a loss for words, because beneath Daniel's elegance, she saw something she had always overlooked, a heart that had once been fiercely loyal. The verdict was finally read, the divorce was finalized, the assets returned to Daniel's full control, and Lara's family, including Evan, were dragged into separate legal proceedings for embezzlement and conspiracy. When the judge's gavel hit the table, it was like the closing of a very long chapter in Daniel's life. Lara turned, hoping for some semblance of love in the eyes of the man who had once adored her. But Daniel simply stood, straightened his suit jacket, and said quietly, I hope you find peace, Lara. Even if it's not with me anymore. There was no resentment, no anger, just the relief of a man finally free from the lies that had held him captive. Outside the building, the sun was high, casting new light on a new life. Daniel stood for a moment, letting the wind hit his face, and for the first time since this had begun, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Jordan patted him on the shoulder. It's over, he said. Adrian added, and you won without losing your honor. Daniel smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes when someone is finally free. Not victory, he said quietly. Just truth returning to its rightful place. He walked away from the building without looking back. Because for Daniel Hale, his past was over. And ahead, the world seemed larger than ever, more silent, purer, and entirely his. Betrayal can break a heart, but it can't break a person with self-control, honor, and intelligence. Daniel won not because he retaliated, but because he remained his best self, even when hurt.
Thank you for watching. But don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.